Fiona Lake, a rural photographer. We are so, it's our privilege to have you with us today and to share a bit of your lessons learned and to tell us a little bit more about your journey and just to share some of those, I guess, the high points and the low points, because this whole series is about sharing entrepreneurial women's journeys with other women also in the rural space. And I also know you're very passionate about the rural area, the region, and so forth. So I guess before we talk a little bit more about your journey and maybe some strategies that worked for you, tell me a little bit more about yourself and also about your initiatives, business, etc.
Right. Well, I grew up on a family farm, wheat sheep farm, and I lived for nearly 20 years in different rural areas, different rural industries from Victoria, New South Wales up to far north Queensland. So probably an unusual diversity. And then I developed a business when I was living in remote areas, like more than 100 kilometres from the nearest town. And it really started when I started work on a remote cattle station in far north Queensland. And it was a total revelation to me. It was like landing in heaven, but it was something I knew nothing about. And I knew most Australians wouldn't know anything about it either. It was so different from where I grew up on a farm in the south. And ever since then, I've been, I sort of can't help myself, basically. I love telling these stories and trying to explain what it's like to work and live in these areas. So my whole business really was set up really to advocate for people in remote areas.
So I guess you've been doing this for a number of years now, and I just had a look on on your website and so forth, and just amazing photos and so forth that you've also taken and shared around. But what I'd like to know is what have you found that you really enjoy about this entrepreneurial process?
I love finding gaps, and I'm always on the lookout for gaps. And I feel lucky that I'm just naturally like that, because it's enabled me to adapt. Because it really, in business, and probably increasingly so, but it's adapt or die, basically. And I've had to, someone actually recently said to me, oh, you have to reinvent yourself every 10 years. And it was I hadn't heard anyone say that, and it was very interesting because I thought about that a lot, because for me, I've had to reinvent myself, because one of the things I was going to touch on later, but it's worth mentioning now in case I forget later, is, goodness, I've forgotten what I was going to say. No, that's it. That if you're any good at what you do, and if you keep at it, you will become good at what you do, because you'll starve otherwise. But if you're any good at what you do, other people will copy. They will emulate what you do. And if you're in a niche market, that means you can do a starve. So you have to constantly keep ahead and keep reinventing yourself and keep learning new skills, looking for new gaps, little things you can do as technology evolves, because a lot of it now is technology driven. So I've become increasingly interested probably in technology and what it can do for me, which is quite different to when I started.
Oh, yeah, I can just imagine the photography industry. I mean, and I've also seen it develop over the years, and I can just imagine the challenges associated with actually, reinventing yourself constantly also now in the virtual space. So that's a real challenge in itself. So I guess, over the years, there would have been quite a few stumbling blocks that you came across, and probably some difficult times as well. Is there maybe kind of one of these difficult times or stumbling blocks that you can talk about, and also how you've overcome that, and what kind of approach you take to overcome stumbling blocks that that hit you and that you feel that I really struggle now, but I need to get out of this?
Tenacity is probably something also I have in spades, and that can be a two-edged sword, because you need to also know when to walk away from something that, even though you know it should work and it would make the world a better place, it's not working. which usually for me means it's financially not viable. For example, a good example is that I love holding exhibitions, and they're really, really powerful. To hold them in capital cities, in a high-profile venue, you reach a sector of the community that you could not reach any other way. But financially, very difficult because they're expensive to run, very time-consuming, and ultimately people can look and not necessarily buy. So I've had to sort of step back from that and go, well, I love doing them, but I'll go broke if I keep doing them. But there's other things too that I've probably hung on to a bit longer, but sometimes I've just been on the brink of giving up and something has come good. And quite often it's taken me years. I have an idea and it might take 10 or even 20 years. For example, my first book, which is actually a very good example, I started working on it in 1986.
Wow.
And sent proposals. Yes, well, it wasn't published till 2005. So there's a very good example. It was just under 20 years. I sent proposals to publishers who, two of them came back and said, oh, we love what you've written, which were the captions I'd laboured over because I thought of myself as a photographer, not a writer. But, the photos aren't as good and it's very expensive to publish photos, so basically not interested. I was sure that the public would be interested. So then I started producing postcards, which I sold right across the north from Broome to Townsville, basically, because at the time, all the postcards you could buy, and they were quite popular at the time, were of Hereford standing in green rolling hills that were obviously in the New England area of New South Wales and further south. Yeah. They had no relevance, basically, to the north. And a lot of tourists were driving through areas that they would think they were national parks because they never saw any cattle. They didn't see anyone working because the places are huge, and there's actually only one cattle yard that I can think of that the public can see between probably Mount Isa and Darwin, roughly 2,000 kilometres.
Yeah.
Yet they're the biggest cattle stations in the world. So, and I sold these postcards and I learnt a massive amount. I hate selling. I learnt that. I probably knew that to start with. But that's another thing. If you're passionate about driving something in particular, there will be lots of elements that you actually don't like. And you've just got to suck it up and get on with it to get to the end result. But yes, I've often persisted for years to get some things through that I want. And my first book is probably one of the best examples.
Wow, you talk about tenacity, and certainly you do have tenacity, just listening to you. What would be other things that you think have been important in your mind, in having a good mindset in order to move forward on your journey? And kind of what are some of these mindset things that you can share with us and other women?
Incorrigible optimism. And I think anyone with a rural background, particularly if you grew up on a farm, as I did, you have to be like that, because if you're not, you'd have your head in the oven, so to speak. You have to, when things don't go well, which usually means the weather, but it can be markets and other things, but usually it's the weather, you have to be able to find something good in it. I grew up on a mixed farm, which was mainly fat lambs, wool and grain, mostly wheat. So whenever it rained, it was inconveniencing something. And when it didn't rain, it was bad for something else. So you learn, you have to be the kind of person who can turn things around, and you will gnash your teeth. I mean, sometimes it's taken me not just hours, days or weeks, but months to get over something that really got on my goat, something that should have worked, didn't, or the occasional person who could have helped and instead threw rocks in my path, which is something not a lot of people talk about. But if you're in business long enough, you probably will come across someone who can make life difficult. And so, yes, the power of being optimistic and choosing, and it's a deliberate choice to use frustration as fuel for the fire is what I would describe it as, because when I was knocked back by publishers initially, they were experts, and I thought, well, I don't know anything, but sort of I did. It's an odd sort of a thing in the way I didn't have any confidence. But on the other hand, I did as a consumer and being passionate. And I thought, if I love this, there must be other people who do, because I don't consider myself so special that if I'm interested in something, I'm the only one on the planet. So that sometimes is what I use to reassure myself that I know if I like something, there will be others who do too. You just have to find enough to make it viable.
So, yes, I guess you touch about how you see yourself, and that's, I guess, what I'd also like to know is how do you see yourself in this whole space of business? Do you see yourself as an entrepreneur? You're certainly an artist, you're a photographer, but you're also in the space of business and entrepreneurship. So how do you see yourself in this space?
I probably hadn't actually used or heard the term entrepreneurial in relation to me until fairly recently, and a couple of other people did. And that is something too that I'd advise people to do. Listen to what other people are saying about you, because often they'll see things in yourself, because I just go and do it. And I think most people, I presume, are the same. You just go and do it. And it's not until someone else comments or you look back and go, oh, well, no one else was doing that. That was pioneering, because, well, like my website is an example. When it came online in 2003, it was unique, and in a way it still is, because journalists have an obligation to tell the news. Artists have an obligation usually to creating things of beauty, but not necessarily advocating. So I sort of cross over a lot of these different fields. And I've lost my train of thought.
No, that's fine. We're just talking about how you see yourself in this space of entrepreneurship.
Yes. So yes, often it's only when you look back, I think, that you realise, because you just get lost in actually doing it, and you're thinking about your aim at the end, and you're moving towards that. And that's another thing too. Actually, it's fantastic to be asked questions, and I recommend anybody in business, if you get interviewed, jump at the chance. Or also running workshops is something I've also found incredibly valuable, because people ask you questions, forces you to think about what you do and what you know that could be of use to other people.
Yeah.
And so it forces you to formulate things that probably you took for granted, or you just hadn't sat down and thought about and put into words.
Fiona, is there somebody, and I'm sure, maybe one or more, but I just think maybe about someone that you really admire, and why?
There's probably a raft of people. And I'd also add that I tend not to hang around in photography circles much. I often think you learn more. I tend to be very outward looking. I have a lot of different interests. So there's people in business I would admire. Ida Buttrose probably springs to mind as one of the most famous, because she started her magazine, and I know from writing magazine articles and being a bit involved in the print media how incredibly difficult and brave that would have been, and how much money she would have needed, how much she was risking to put into that magazine. And ultimately she had to close it, which I think was a tragedy. And probably it's a good example too of something that's probably not talked about enough, because often we think of the people who have been successful, if they keep on being successful, and in a way you're only as good as the thing that you've just done. Everyone has short memories, but Ida would be probably top of my list in the business world, because I think she'll come out and say things that aren't necessarily popular, but things that need to be said, which is another trait that I greatly admire.
Fiona, I mean, you're a photographer, so that's a creative process, and you combine that with business. So how do you kind of go about progressing an idea, and where do you get your ideas, and how do you get your ideas, and initially, and then the process of progressing it?
I actually have the opposite problem. I have too many ideas, always have. Ever since primary school, my head is full of ideas. And in terms of business, it's just cogitating on which will be viable, and often they might have to wait. They might have to wait till other things have changed. Technology's better, whatever. Again, coming back to my first book, I was able to publish it myself because I had a website and I could sell direct. Without a website, without the access online, my business would not exist. So even if I'd thought of being able to do this 10 years earlier than I did, it wouldn't have been feasible. So yes, my problem is too many ideas. I often see gaps, things that aren't being addressed, just as they appear. Yeah. But there's not enough time and not enough money and not enough energy to go and address them all. So it's trying to pace yourself, and sometimes I do spread myself too thin with too many projects that I want to move forward with.
Would you maybe tell me a little bit about some of those projects?
The ones that I've got on the back burner, or the ones that I've already done?
Oh, it's probably the ones that you've done, and maybe one or two of the ones that's on the back burner.
Well, apart from books, and then I went to exhibitions, and then running workshops is something I've been doing more recently, and also farm tours, which I started with in 2003 with a company called Quadrant. They actually approached me. This is another point, I guess. You never know. I plan long term. I plan years in advance, not just next week, next month, years in advance. I have all these ideas sort of backed up into the future. And 2003, they approached me after I had a stand opposite them in Rockhampton at Beef Week. And all week long, I'm really an introvert. I'm here in my office and I love it, but I also love it when I go out and talk to people. It's sort of this, change of pace. And after seeing me talk to people for a whole week, they actually asked me whether I'd be interested in running tours. And the first one I'm leading is next year.
Oh,
so again, that's another classic example of a bit of a lead time between 2003 and 2018. In terms of other projects I'd like to do, one is related a bit to the project I put up for the Riddick Rural Women's Award last year, which is now everybody in the bush has a phone now, including the ones who don't have mobile phone reception because they're in town, they're in cities, they're visiting for business or on holidays. And probably most are taking photos, and most of them are putting them online. And so it's really changed from being rural life used to be represented by professionals, journalists, professional photographers, ad agencies, etc. A very narrow spectrum of people, which was a bit of a problem because most were based in cities and didn't know one end of a cow from the other. Now it's turned around and everybody has the potential to be a marketing agent for the bush, an advocate. But there is a real need to help people create better images and not accidentally reinforce stereotypes, which I see quite a lot of. I'm a detail freak and I will tend to notice when there's photos portraying things that could be misconstrued. There's a lot of that, which are perfectly innocuous, but because they're not being explained, people who aren't familiar with what they're seeing will not understand. So that's another project that I've got poking along, but it's something I need funding for. So I'm just keeping my beady eye out, looking for opportunities to push this idea forward. And, it might take quite a while. But, yeah, that's not something I give up on, unless, of course, someone else goes and does it instead, in which case I'll let it go. But at the moment, there is nobody. There is no one at all running workshops or doing public speaking, directly assisting people on how to create better images. Because the last point I'd make too in relation to that is that people see images and text at the same time, but they interpret the images instantly. Then they read the text. That means that they've already started forming an opinion once they've seen the photo. So photos are so much more important, creating the initial impression, and it's very, very hard to change an initial impression. And animal rights extremist groups understand this perfectly. That's why they put these graphic images online and in their advertisements on television and in print media, etc., because they know people see those images and it's indelible. It's fixed in their mind that this is cruel, that's cruel, whatever, regardless of the words. So, yeah, it's a vital need I see that I hope to get to address in future.
Yeah. How would you define success for yourself?
It's probably because, again, it's the idea is squeaking for attention. I tend to always be looking at the next thing. So once I've got something else done, I'm never pausing to think, you know, it took me 10 years to do that and now I've done it, which in a way it would be good to probably do a bit more of that. But there's always these other things. I'm always looking at what I haven't managed to conquer or complete yet. So I'm always looking forward.
So it sounds to me like as long as you feel you're growing in the process, that's success to you?
Yes, sorry, I got sidetracked from your initial question. Yes, it is. It's actually a really good question, because I don't think of it as financial success, because if it was financial success, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing. I would be a photographer on the coast taking wedding, landscape, whatever photographs, for example, or in another sphere entirely. Because when I finished year 12, for example, for the university entries that I was applying for, there was a huge range of, I mean, it's quite amazing really when I look back at the range of careers I considered going into. So success in a way for me is making something financial enough out of something that you think will make a difference to the world. To me, that is a real challenge, because anyone can go and do what you love or make a career where money is the number one priority. But to marry the two, that's a real challenge. And to maintain that is quite... So my ability to adapt, I think, would be something I would call... I feel quite... I don't know whether proud of the word, but I'm pleased about it, because it has been tough, adapting and changing and taking on new technology and risks. I've had to take so many risks over my career.
What about, you know, a lot of times, especially in this entrepreneurial space, there's all these, you know, entrepreneurial leaders that say you have to do this and this and this and this. So very often you read in the entrepreneurship space and you read about formulas for success. Would you say that there is such a formula for success in the entrepreneurial space, or there's certain things that you think is absolutely essential to do to progress your entrepreneurial journey?
Yes, that's a good question, and that's a really big topic, because in the age of social media, of course, we're bombarded with platitudes and simplistic little slogans. And I don't think there is a single recipe. Everybody has to do what fits for them. Ultimately, you do have to really care about what you do, because that's what will keep you going when things don't go so well, when you get knocked back. If you really, really care, I resist the urge to use the word passionate, because it's so overused, but that's basically what it is. You have to be through and through, care about what you do. So it's not about self-promotion, it's not about climbing a ladder, or not about making more money, although we all have to eat, obviously. I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna. And a lot of platitudes, I think, are quite... well, some of the things we hear can be quite damaging. One of them is, oh, women can have it all. You know, well, it's just such a pack of rubbish. The reality is, if you have children, if you have a family, you'll have to make compromises. And I've had to make so many decisions, as every woman has who has children, about, you know, career and putting family first. It's a constant juggling act, and what's right yesterday could be completely different to what is right tomorrow. it just changes always.
Fiona, in terms of, I guess, have you had some really good mentors in your journey? And I also like to know, what's your view on mentorship?
I think mentors are great, although tricky, because it's tempting, I think, for people to become dependent on mentors, and probably mentors who are working in a different space, potentially a lot more effective than somebody working in a very similar sort of a sphere. I think you can often learn more from people working in other areas, and that geographically as well too, someone doing what you do but in another country, or someone working in another industry. I haven't actually had mentors as such. I have had people who've helped me in terms of even just encouragement, and I mentioned this actually in my last book, because I actually got a couple of pages thanking people who had gone out of their way to help me. And some of them would probably not even be aware of what a difference they made, because they just encouraged me at the right time. They introduced me to someone else, something like that. But I haven't had mentors because I've sort of rowed my own boat, and there actually hasn't been anybody who has a business just like mine. So there wasn't anyone to emulate, and there wasn't anyone to ask, and actually there still isn't, because, and that's a scary thing about doing these books originally, which involved tens of thousands of dollars, and literally the first one I would have gone broke if I hadn't sold it. There actually was no one I could ask who would have had more insight into whether it would be financially viable than me, which, and it's not meant to be egotistical, but it's just, it's a very specialised business, and I know my subject, and I've got to know that field fairly well in a way that probably no one else has, and certainly not then when I was starting.
Well, you certainly sound like you would be a fantastic mentor to others that want to follow this type of path. I guess, Fiona, the other aspect that I would like to know about is, I guess, your view on partnerships. You spoke previously about, you partnering with this initiative next year. What is your view on partnerships? Is that something that entrepreneurial women should be seeking out, or, just kind of what's your view on that?
Partnerships have probably never been something I've been involved with, but I've helped others, but sort of in an independent capacity. A good example is committees for conferences. I've offered to do a particular role and gone and done a particular role. So it's sort of a partnership, but it's probably not the kind of partnership that is typically thought of when you mention partnership.
Short-term collaboration, yeah.
Yes, collaborations, and probably it boils down to personality, perhaps. I tend to be very independent, and I'm probably spoiled. I like my own way. That's not to suggest that I don't compromise, because obviously you have to compromise. You won't survive in business if you don't compromise, and you can't negotiate. You can't agree to disagree, and all these sorts of traits you need to develop if you didn't have them to start with. Partnerships, entrepreneurs are often fairly individual type people, and probably very independent like me. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Moving on to strategies. What strategies have worked really well for you in progressing your entrepreneurial journey through the years?
Strategies in particular.
That could be anything. Could be. Was it online, offline? Just kind of things that you think have really made a difference in your journey, pushing that forward. Things that you've done really well, maybe.
Right. Well, one thing I think has turned out to be an asset is the fact that I am interested in so many different things. Apart from politics, there's actually not a lot that I'm not interested in. I don't find politics particularly riveting, but I could pretty well hold a conversation on most other topics, or, I'm always interested in learning. So ever since the internet, I was like a pig in mud because there's so much to learn. Twitter would be my favourite social media platform because I've learned more via Twitter than anything else I can think of. Side benefits include I've become personally a lot more tolerant. Some people who know me might laugh about that, but I have. More patient. I've learnt to write better. In addition to learning what other people are doing in other countries, and because it's shone a light on the fact there's so much wheel reinventing going on. So anyone who's considering running any kind of business, I would strongly encourage them to have a chunk of time every day online, having a look around, really, really getting to know what other people are doing in their sphere. It doesn't matter whether they're involved in rural tourism, whether they're creating and selling products, or whether they're providing some sort of services, whatever it is. Really, really research thoroughly up to the minute what other people are doing. Not so you can emulate what they're doing, although obviously if they're doing something good you haven't thought of, go for it. But often so you can provide something that's different. Because ultimately survival means not competing on price, but competing on quality, and providing something that's different, value adding, going the extra mile, doing something that's different. And in the travel sphere, for example, the tour I'm running to the UK and Ireland next year, I've had a really good look around at what else other people are doing, and there's all sorts of good things being done. I'm particularly interested in meeting people in person, and there will be several dozen, probably 40 or more different people across the UK and Ireland who will be coming to have dinner with us that I've got to know via Twitter. Some of them I've already stayed with. Some have come to Australia and come to see me here. And you get to know people remarkably well. And so that's an element of difference. That is something that will make this tour different. And anyone who's in business, particularly these days, because as I said before, if you're good at what you do, other people will emulate it. So you've constantly got to stay ahead and look for new ways to combining different things. I mean, there is a saying, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. Someone will have done it before, but there certainly is new ways of combining different elements to create something that in combination is unique.
You mentioned the issue of Twitter, and that's been working really well for you. Are there also other ways in which you connect with your audience and your customer base, or have you found that Twitter is really the one that you like to pursue?
Well, oddly enough, I actually sell very little on Twitter, or any social media platform. So it's actually just fortunate that that's not why I went on social media. I actually went because I'm a sticky beak and a bowerbird for information, and I wanted to learn how it all works. And yes, it's vicarious travel too, because we can't be jetting off all over the world. You go on Twitter and it's like you've travelled because you talk to someone on the other side of the country. Other side of the planet, rather. So connecting with customers, that is sort of a fundamental business principle that you should do it in as many different ways as possible. And one mistake I do see, which can end up putting a business on shaky ground, is relying too much on one particular avenue. And for example, Facebook pages, quite often someone's, start up a Facebook page, and they put all their business effort onto Facebook. All these social media platforms, and most of them, the basic model certainly is free. They're struggling to make money. So it's a bit of a no-brainer that they're going to have to increasingly either run advertising or introduce paid subscriptions or whatever. They're going to make it more and more difficult for businesses to just use these social media apps for nothing, because at the end of the day we all need to eat, including the people who run them. So I strongly recommend people always send isn't quite the word, but direct customers, or encourage them to visit their own real estate online, which is basically their own website. And I love conventional media. I love magazines. I love newspapers. I love the radio, and I love television. So really connecting with customers, you want to do it in as many different ways as you can and try and find what works for you, but also try and expand your horizons a bit into the things that might not be your cup of tea, even if you only do them a little bit, and concentrate on your favourite areas. But don't put all your eggs in the one basket when it comes to communicating with your audience, customers or prospective customers.
What would be, I mean, one really important or overall your greatest lesson that you've learned in your journey? And I know this is a big one because, you know, in our journeys we have so many lessons that we learn. But what would be maybe one big one that you would like to share with other women out there?
It's very hard to narrow down to just one, of course. Persistence is probably something that's sprung to my mind over the last year or so, because there's been a few things that have come good that I've sort of been plugging away on for years. And you can get some good wins, so to speak, early on, but that won't continue unless you persist through the thick and the thin and be adaptable. So persistence is, but it's got to be measured and thoughtful persistence, obviously, because you don't hang on to the things, as I mentioned before, that, you know, the writing's on the wall, and sometimes you can give up a bit later than you should have. But it's very difficult to know the precise moment when you should give something up, because sometimes I have been on the brink of saying goodbye to something, and it's come back to life through unexpected sources. If you persist too, you will get a certain level of respect from other people in the business, which is something that's really, I don't know, heartwarming. I think there's a better way of putting it, but that's what I found too, probably. I did win a social media award earlier this year at the Rural Press Club in Queensland.
Wow.
And it was actually really nice, the comments people made in business who have seen my photos dating back a couple of decades or more, but the comments made were actually really, really nice. Yeah.
Fiona, if you can think of maybe one amazing thing that you would still want to do in the future, and you've already done some amazing things, and your photography is absolutely, you know, outstanding. So you've already done so much, but what would be one thing that you still think, yes, I want to do that?
One idea that I did put on the back burner was exhibitions overseas. I persisted with that for about 10 years. Very expensive, you need funding, and there's funding through mobs like the Australia Council, but they tend to go for new media projects, not regional projects, nothing to do with agriculture. So I've pretty well ticked every no box there is, because really that's the sort of project that you couldn't do on your own viably unless you just wanted to throw away $10,000, for example, and never see it again. I do have some other projects. One is in relation to the falling rate of Indigenous stockmen on cattle stations. And I've been pursuing avenues to help this project get up off the ground over the last 2 years. It's something that's not discussed, and I think the project I've got in mind could really make a difference. So that's another example. My third thing that springs to mind too is getting a group of Australian rural women together and going overseas to, there's several, 3 spring to mind off the top of my head, rural women's conferences in other countries. That just fantastic. I've got a second Twitter account that promotes agricultural events. So I've got to know some of these events quite well, and I just think it would be a fantastic experience to this interglobal, inter-country networking through agriculture is fantastic. Yeah. But I'd love to see it expand more, and I think we're just on the tip of the iceberg because it has begun, into actual in-person travel, reciprocal visiting and sharing, and less wheel reinventing. So resources, time, energy, because energy is something that's probably so underestimated in business. People talk about money and time and all these other things. Energy is probably the resource that you can't buy. You can't pay someone else to do it. It's probably the most valuable resource. So you do have to be careful where you put your energy, because it's not a bottomless pit. And if you give out too much on a project that doesn't come into fruition, either dies or it needs a bit longer, then you don't have the energy to put into something else.
Very, very good advice. Fiona, is there anything else that you think, maybe tips or advice like that you'd like to share before I ask you your last question?
There's so many. There's so many. I can't think of just one. No, I can't think of one more.
Okay, Fiona, where can we find you online?
My website is FionaLake.com.au. I'm on lots of social media. Twitter, of course, is my favourite. And LinkedIn I love for business reasons. It's like a self-updating business card file and a perpetual free conference, as I describe it to people. Also, I do.
That's just Fiona Lake.
Yes, my LinkedIn profile is Fiona Lake. But and I put a lot of work into this, and actually you talked about success before. This is something that I must admit I was pleased about. For example, I do occasionally, not as often as I should, but check search engine rankings, because that is something too that I touch on in workshops, how to get good search engine rankings. Because online, you can create the most fantastic website, social media platform, account, whatever, but no one will find it. So there is a lot of skill and ongoing work to make sure that you get good rankings. And I discovered yesterday, for a particular search term relating to my business, I came 9th and 10th, which is just down the bottom of the first page, for a search term that got 53 million results. So yeah, so that's actually an achievement which people wouldn't necessarily get unless they've got a website and they know how hard it is to keep your website on the first page of results over a sustained period of time, because this website dates back to 2003. So you've just got to chip away. And everyone wants things overnight, but including me. Yeah. I'm the world's worst. I readily admit that. But ultimately, it's like building, something one grain of sand at a time. Everything you do helps, and everything you learn can help you survive in business. And, always listen to advice and just take what fits you and disregard the rest. I'm always wary of sometimes, including, I don't want anyone to come to one of my workshops either and hear everything I say and presume all of it is going to apply to them. And tomorrow, some of it might be outdated, some of it mightn't suit their particular circumstances. So I think learning, becoming your own judge is really important, because ultimately you're the only one who knows what you're capable of, what you're prepared to do. And if you're in a niche business, you will know it better than anybody else. So you have to develop your own judgment rather than asking other people's opinion, whether they think it's good or not, whatever. And the ultimate thing, if you're selling something, product or service, if people are buying it, that is a measure of success. I don't think of that in financial terms, but if they've been prepared to part with their hard-earned cash to buy something you've made or provided, that's something to feel good about. And I do actually think of that as being successful, including comments I get from people who've bought books, who've told me what the books have meant to them, either because they've moved away from the bush, some of them live in other countries and missing Australia, all these sorts of things. You get feedback. And of course, you try and ignore, you will get the odd negative just for the sake of being negative, and you do learn to let that be water off a duck's back. If it's not constructive, if there's no grain of truth in what they're saying, yes, you do learn to disregard it. And that's pretty hard for women because we want to please everybody. But,
Fiona, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing these valuable lessons. As I've listened to you, I just keep on thinking, oh, yeah, that is so true. That is so true. That is so true. And I know that also sharing this with the rest of the WIRE participants and wider, it's certainly going to be very valuable for other women to tap a little bit into your journey as well. Thank you very much. And I will be in touch in the future, definitely, to talk more about, potential things doing together, but also really would like to see where your journey is still going into the future.
All right, thanks very much, Retha, and thanks for asking such good questions, because it's priceless. It really is great to be asked good questions and make you stop and think and put into words, and it's really, really valuable. Thank you.